Firstly, Labor, of course, has committed to a net zero carbon emissions target for 2015. Concerns have been raised today by the National Farmers Federation that perhaps livestock production could be affected by agriculture being included in that target. Are you worried about the impact on the agriculture sector?
Well, getting emissions down in the agriculture sector and as well as transport will be important parts of what needs to be done longer term. It's important by setting a 2050 target that you've got a long-term target, no sudden moves. You give the chance for sectors to be able to have their say. I understood that the National Farmers Federation were also looking in this space of how they could reduce emissions and be able to also be carbon neutral along the same time frame. So there are organisations that are thinking longer term about this, but this is an important thing to do. It can mean that we have stronger jobs. It can mean that we have better sources of energy longer term, and that we do the right thing by the climate, and Australia plays its part in a global effort to tackle what is one of the big issues of our time.
When will Labor actually detail how it plans to reach this target? I mean, there's been absolutely no details on that so far.
Well, what we've said is that, like 73 governments across the planet, like every state and territory government on this country or on our own home turf, have been able to commit to this target, and we want to be able to work with industry in relation to how we actually get there and what are the steps, the concrete steps that can be taken, and you'll see that released over the course of time. I note that the government has been particularly keen to say, for example, that there's been no economic modelling released. Well, I'd put this to them. Release the economic modelling that you had done about the impact of your trade agreements on the Australian economy, and they don't have any. So you've never heard Mr Morrison say in relation to a trade agreement where there's been no economic modelling that if it costs jobs he wouldn't do it even though it's important to do. You've never heard Scott Morrison say, for example, if businesses use technology in a way to improve their operations but it costs jobs, you wouldn't do it even though it's important to do. And on climate change he says he won't do anything on this because it might cost jobs even though it's important to do. There needs to be some consistency on this, and they've done no economic modelling on trade agreements, so why is that good, but not the same on climate change action?
But don't you think that Labor should have perhaps released its proposal with a clear plan for what voters could potentially be thinking about in years to come?
Voters are thinking about this issue now. I mean, look back a few months ago when, in the middle of the bushfires, the government all it was offering was thoughts and prayers to those who were affected, and the public reacted to that and said, we need to have more than this. We need to be able to have something that says we can start tackling these type of issues so that they have less and less impact on people longer term, and all we get is inaction. People need some sort of concrete form of action and a commitment that we will work towards that. And what we've said is we've set our ambition. Now we will walk towards that. We will work with people in developing those policies, and we'll have something more than just spin and gumph as what we've got from this government. We have a Minister for Emissions Reduction who can't really tell you how much will be reduced in terms of emissions and in a concrete way through the stuff that they're doing. And we do need better. And the public has spoken out, particularly through the course of these terrible bushfires, expecting that governments should do better. They're the government, they're in the driver's seat. Show us what you can do, and if you won't lead, well then Labor will take the steps necessary to show that leadership.
Let's move on. Labor is claiming that the Coalition's Urban Congestion Fund unfairly benefited the government ahead of last year's federal poll. Now, Labor has conducted its own analysis, finding that funds went to government and marginal Labor seats. But in terms of the projects that have actually been funded, is Labor saying that these places were potentially undeserving of the funds themselves?
I think we should be absolutely clear that the public is getting sick of the Coalition using taxpayer money as a political sponge that can help support their ambitions. Just like they did in sports rorts, they've done it here, where nearly every marginal Liberal seat or seat that was targeted, the ones that they wanted to spare, they had a prime ministerial visit or a senior visit announcing some sort of project in the way that this has happened. This is not the first time this has come up. The Australian, for example, months ago detailed how the Coalition had basically shoved money in a very political way on these infrastructure projects. We've been saying as Labor for ages that Infrastructure Australia should independently make those assessments free of political interference, because what we've seen with the coalition is nothing but them meddling in a way that is using taxpayer funds to progress their political ambitions rather than doing the right thing by communities that recognise that infrastructure makes an impact on people's lives.
Just finally, I want to chat about the Germany attacks of last week. A suspected far-right extremist killed several people in Western Germany. Should we be worried about the threat posed by right-wing extremists?
Well, it's estimated 9 people lost their lives in that attack last week in Hanau, Germany. You hardly heard anything in the Australian media about it. It was relegated to news in brief or page, well down the back of newspapers in terms of what's gone on. And I think this reflects a bigger issue that, if the religion of the attacker was different, this would be a major issue. And I don't think that enough's been done on Australian soil to deal with this. In the US, the FBI has elevated the concern about white nationalists and far-right extremism. The Department of Homeland Security there last September has now elevated as an issue that they're considering adding more resources and dealing with this more. Lawmakers in the US are telling the State Department to start prescribing some of these groups and acting on them. And here we are, frankly, doing hardly anything to deal with this, in spite of the fact that horrifically in the last 12 months, one of our own went over to New Zealand and committed those terrible acts in Christchurch, and I just don't think it's good enough. I mean, is it the case that if it's the only time we pay attention to terrorist acts, if it's brown on white? I mean, I basically put it in those very blunt terms. I don't care if it's Islamist, and I don't care if it's supremacist. If it presents a threat to the national security of this nation, we should do more, and it's disgraceful that we're not doing enough.
Unfortunately, we have run out of time. Labor MP Ed Husic, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks, Danica.